Yo, what's up? It's SolarLune. Let's make a video. Yay. We're just gonna start. So basically, I'm making a video about this thread I found on our gamedev, which says things I wish someone told me when I started working on my game, which is a good subject. Basically, this person is a developer. He released a game recently on Steam. It's this game, which is doing rather well in my opinion. I think that's pretty good. It got 99 positive reviews, or 94%. 99 reviews and 94% are positive, which is good. And it was released on February 19th, so that's just in the past couple of months. That's some good numbers. And so he basically created this list over the course of development, and it's just kind of general advice for game developers. There's some really good advice in here, but I don't agree with everything. And so I was just going to basically talk a little bit about this because these are good points to discuss. So the first point that he mentions, and he also mentions he uses Unity specifically. So if you don't use Unity, or if you use a different engine or language or whatever, it doesn't all apply. So I don't use Unity. So we're going to talk about that a little bit as well. So first things first, he mentions that making a complex, polished game is 100 times more difficult than you've ever imagined. I cannot overemphasize this. He is 100% correct. It's very difficult to make games. It is extremely difficult. If you've ever opened Unity, Godot, Game Maker, Construct, Stencilworks, RPG Maker, Lua with Love2D, Flash Punk with Flixel with ActionScript, Multimedia Fusion, game. What's the other Click Team game? A Click Team game creation tool, Click and Play. I'm just trying to flex on people, to be honest. Pygame with Python, Piglet with Python, Megazoo, ZZT, Pixel Game Maker, RPG Maker MV, RPG Maker XP, 2001, 2003. I'm just trying to flex at this point. I just wanted to show off. I'm sorry. But all these tools are used to make games. If you've ever opened one and tried to make a game with it, you probably know how difficult it is. It's very hard. Yeah. So I think this is worth a discussion on its own in terms of how we can more effectively be effective in making games, because it's a hard task. It's not nearly as hard, in my opinion, to write music. It's not nearly as hard to draw or be an artist or do 3D modeling or anything like that, or be an architect with 3D CAD tools or Blender or 3D modeling tools. None of that I feel like is as difficult to approach and to sustain as being a game developer. It's hard, and that's just not talking about the financial aspects of being successful in terms of making consistent sales to be able to keep up development, but rather just talking about the fundamental concept of making games. It's something that's very difficult, and it's easy to lose motivation and focus. And I feel like this is worth a discussion on its own, not in this video, but a very important point, that it's hard to make games, and how can we it's hard to make games, and it's worth discussing the concept of how one can more effectively make games simpler, as well as focus on making simpler games, and maybe also what's the most efficient part of a game, because a lot of games are big in that they have a lot of aspects, but really the fundamental core things you do in the game are also the most fun things, and those are the things that are 95% of the game. Like if you were to take Zelda Breath of the Wild, 99% of the game is not really, like 99% of the game is the moment-to-moment stuff. You're not really going to spend much time on, let's say, one particular NPC quest. You're going to spend most time running around, hang gliding, shooting your bow and arrow, throwing swords at, bokoblins or whatever they're called. Because I'm not sure what the name is, even though I'm pretty sure that's close. It's the moment-to-moment gameplay, and really, you want to get that stuff, the moment-to-moment, the 95% of the game. You want to get that stuff solid. You don't really want to focus too much on the 5% of, having a lot of quests, because honestly, it's important that you have variety, but that variety is just breaking up the moment-to-moment gameplay, which is the bulk of the game, which is the most important part, which is also the most fun part in that game. And so it's just like, you know, that's worth a discussion of its own on how we can more effectively and efficiently make games and where we should focus our efforts as game developers, all that stuff. So it's a good point. It's a really good point right off the bat. Other things about sprites and physics, those are important. Having a style guide document early on and talking about some UI stuff, that's important. He mentions never using magic strings. That's also really important. Never use magic strings or even string constants. Use enums instead if you're going to be using variables for identifiers. I agree with most of this. I am unsure as to the difference of string constants versus enums in this person's estimation, because they're basically the same as long as the string constant is unique. Like if you have an enum, you know, a set of enums that represent, let's say, character types, right? You have like a warrior, you have mage, you have you know, whatever, you know, thief, you have, you know, red mage, you have all these, you know, 4 or 5 classes or whatever that are an enum or a set of enums. And then you have string constants that are essentially the same thing. They're, as long as they're unique, they serve the same purpose. Like, you know, you're going to be referring to these variables to tell them apart. You're not really going to be referring to them for their internal values. You're not going to be referring to an enum to get the number inside. Like, oh, I'm looking for the number 1 that represents the warrior, or I guess the number 0 that represents the warrior. No, you're going to be looking at the name. Did you pass into this function a warrior? Because if so, then we'll draw the warrior icon. If you passed in the thief, then we'll draw the thief icon. Like that's it. So I don't know about that, but yeah, you shouldn't use magic strings or magic numbers, because that makes it harder to change your code later if you ever change it. And by magic numbers or magic strings or magic variables, basically those are values you're typing in directly into your code, rather than properly building it according to the value that number represents. So for example, if you have a 16 by 16 sprite and you want to get the center point of it, you don't want to add 8 to the X and Y to get the center. You want to add half the width and half the height to get the center. That way, if you ever change the sprite to be bigger, you can easily just use the same code. The code doesn't change. Your sprite changes and everything stays the same. It's still the center because it's halfway into the sprite. It's not about the actual pixels it covers. So you don't want to use magic numbers. That's correct. The next point here, I don't quite recommend or agree with is find big chunks of uninterrupted time for your game. 2 hours is way more productive than 4 separate 30-minute sessions. I do agree that finding big chunks of time would be ideal, but that's not always possible. And interestingly enough, later on, back toward the end, he says, don't get up at 4 a.m. to find time to make your game. I agree with not crunching and having some days off and exercising, you know, making sure you stay healthy. But I don't feel like you can have both of these all of the time. Sometimes you might have to make do with less time and just say, well, I only have 30 minutes right now. I only have an hour right now. Let me do what I can. You know, maybe design a sprite, maybe track down bugs, you know, whatever the case is. Do what I can in this time. Or you say, well, I'm just going to go ahead and go to bed earlier so I can wake up tomorrow earlier to get a uninterrupted time, uninterrupted chunk of time. I think his point was more so, don't sacrifice sleep or sacrifice other aspects of your life to work on games. Like, you want to stay healthy, you want to stay nominal, all systems nominal up here, so that you can more effectively develop your game. And you want to have larger chunks of time if possible. I think the way it's phrased is a little weird, but basically I think his points are fine. It's just you want to try to find a way to give yourself time to work on your game uninterrupted, unproblematic, and just bang away at it, essentially. Yeah. Okay, next point here. Design shouldn't be part of a prototype. Don't try to make it pretty. You'll have to throw it away anyway. Don't waste time on making developer art. It will still look like crap no matter how hard you try. These are good points unless you're good at art. If you're good at art, if you're an artist, then you can, make the art yourself because you're an artist and that's what you do. So I think that's more so poised to people who aren't good at art and aren't going to be using their own art, in which case it's like, well, don't waste your time making something that you're not going to stick with. Unless you're good at art, in which case you can waste your time because you're going to stick with it. So there's no fundamental problems there. Avoid public static in C#. You can't say that you can't just make that statement out the bag. Like, you can't just say, don't use public static. It's like, don't use like that. Don't use class. It's like just don't use this entire like chunk of options. Because and there's no reason. It's just avoid using public static in C#. And he explains a little bit more in the comments, but this statement alone is just not enough. You got to explain it a little bit more. I would never advise staying away from something specifically across the board in any language. And I've been bitten. I have been bitten. I believe that's correct. I have been bitten in the butt many a time by my lack of understanding of things, and yet I still would not say like, oh, don't do this, like avoid this keyword in Go, or avoid that word, that function in GD script with Godot or anything like that. It's up to the developer to know what they're using. Really, try doing less OOP, especially if you're not good at it. Ooh, that's a tough one. I don't agree with this, mainly because I feel like OOP is very well known, and a lot of people go with OOP or object-oriented programming as a start. Saying try doing less, especially if you're not good at it, is more of like a intermediate, advanced developer's approach to things. I feel like maybe not so much with Unity, because I know they're doing more work on like entity component systems and things like that. So it's more of a push toward the ECS, entity component systems, approach to game development. But OOP is such a well-known standard start that I would say you couldn't really make advice that you shouldn't go with that. You should try other means. I feel like that's really more of a, once you get, kind of more familiar with game development, then you can try, maybe exchanging data, like that's what the post says. Exchange data, not objects with states and hierarchies. That's not necessarily bad advice. I just feel like it's not good advice for people who are not really heavily, kind of in that direction already. It's kind of like saying, make sure you have a nice, smooth content pipeline. It's like, you kind of have to be like kind of heavy in game development to really take advantage of that advice. Like that's not bad advice that you want to focus on having a smooth content pipeline, but it's so specific and niche that it's kind of heavy. It's kind of like you gotta like if you're gonna give that advice, you should give, I think, an example of why that's important, as well as how to do that, because not doing OOP is not bad advice. I would say that there's definitely problems with object-oriented programming that don't come up with other approaches, but you kind of have to maybe give an example or give alternatives. Saying exchanging data instead of OOP is like, okay, but how do you like associate data with specific objects? And obviously you can use arrays and things like that, but it feels like that's kind of just like a try making your game better. It's like, how? This is just bad advice right here. I feel like avoid big classes and methods that need any cost. If it needs to be big, it needs to be big. Split by responsibility and do it early. Not necessarily. 300 lines is most likely too much for a class, says who. 30 lines is surely too much for a single method. Completely disagree. Hard disagree. You can't possibly, in my opinion, you can't possibly say across the board that big classes are bad, big methods are bad. I think he does, again, talk about this a little bit more in the comments, but this particular statement is just so, in your face as a solid, don't do X, and it's like, you can't say that. Like, you can't say that big classes are bad. You can't say that big methods are bad. You can't say that they should be split. You can't say that X lines is too much for a single method. It depends on what the method's doing. I feel like you should basically split methods, or split things into methods if they need to be methods. Like if they're, if it's a hook that's being called by another part of an engine, or another object is going to call, like game object that got hurt method, that's basically informing the object that it got hurt or something like that. Like if it's going to be called from another point, then you want to have a method. Or if the method is called multiple times or from multiple places, then you want to have a method. So for example, if you have a function that basically positions an object, like aligns it according to maybe its position in a parent object. So like in a GUI system, like if you have a window and you have an object in there, and there's a function called align, and it basically will like move it according to maybe the center position in that parent dialog. Like that function align would make sense to exist if other objects could call align on this object. Like, maybe the parent window could call it, maybe the object itself could call it, maybe like siblings of the object in the center could call it. Maybe, like, for example, if you have two objects, then they might want to call align on itself. An object might want to call align on itself as well as its sibling in the window, so that they both align at the same time. Things like that. So there's obviously points where you would want to split methods up or make methods, but if those points aren't reached, there's no reason to split a method up. You want to split methods up according to the use of the method in your object, in your code. You don't want to just split because it's like, oh, it's 800 lines, I should split it. It's like, well, if you only call it once and it does one thing, why? There's lots of other good points here. Organize artwork in the same way you organize code. I think that's fine. Don't copy and modify code from your other games. Build yourself a shared library of atomic things that can later be used in your other games. But this is arguable. I don't think it's necessarily necessary to follow this particular line of this particular suggestion. It's not bad. It's like, yeah, you can have a shared library of atomic functions or classes or whatever that you can pull from to use in your later games. But I mean, you don't have to do that. The whole point of code reuse is to reuse code. If your code reuse method is just to copy and paste, that's better than not, basically. So like, if you have it in your mind to go ahead and like copy code that you have for Mega Man 1 when you're making Mega Man 2, like, yeah, go ahead and do it. They made like 4 Mega Mans in 3 years or whatever. It's hard to beat that. It's hard to beat that kind of code reuse. Like, if it works, it works. Like ideally you would have a library or some sort of external directory you're pulling things in from, but that's not really necessary, I feel like. Let's see. Thinking about modding early on, great advice. Definitely advise thinking about modding early on, how you can approach it, making sure the architecture is in a way that basically mods work. Online multiplayer, build it from day one. Definitely advise that. Grow a community on Discord and Reddit. Yeah. Don't offer unfinished versions of your game to streamers or content creators. Hard to disagree, depending on the kind of game it is. I think I agree to if it's like, if your game is I'm only releasing it when it's done, then yeah, I don't think it's really necessary to give them a unfinished version unless it's a demo, where it's just like, yeah, it's unfinished because it's a demo. But if it's like, oh yeah, the game's in early access, then yeah, give them access. Like, that's, I don't see why not. Like, the game's not done yet, but it's available for purchase, so go ahead and give it to them. Let them see what why not? Like, why not let them see what the game's like? If it's available for purchase. If it's not available for purchase, that's one thing, because then it's like you're trying to build hype, but they're hyping based off something that's not done. But if it is available for purchase and people can and are playing it elsewhere, there's no reason, I feel like, to avoid making your game visible in the global community. You want to grow a community on Discord and Reddit. Yeah, that's true. Make builds for all OSs and upload to Steam in a single-click operation. Not bad advice. Don't playtest your game after every change. Write tests, play mode tests, or integration tests. Definitely a good idea to try to automate things as much as possible. Let's see. UI stuff. Okay. Well, this is Unity specific, but it says try to have as much as possible defined in code rather than relying on the editor and its scene or prefab serialization. That's a little strange. I don't know. I'm not sure on that one. Because I'm thinking of Godot and how it, is similar in that it has serialization for its scenes and for its node setups and things like that. I don't know if I would say try to have as much as possible defined in code. That's a maybe. Be consistent about naming and organizing. Yeah, that's fine. Don't cut corners. Don't be sloppy. Okay. I do think you shouldn't cut corners or make compromises on the most important and most difficult parts of your game. But I don't think that it's necessary to, like, writing a long method with a lot of if statements. I don't know what's wrong with that. It seems like I don't know what this person. I don't know this person. I don't want to attribute malice to him or say he's a bad developer or anything like that. By any means, I'm not trying to do that. But it seems like he's talking about long methods as though they're bad, and if statements. A lot of if statements as though they're bad. You could theoretically replace a series of if statements with a switch statement. But if you have to do different things based off of different conditionals, you have to run the conditionals. You have to do if statements. I don't know about that, but I think he's right about the general gist of this, which is don't cut corners, don't make compromises. Be consistent and complete your work as consistently as possible. Think before setting a file name for your game. That's correct. I don't know if you should sleep on it for a week or two. It's not that serious. But it's I feel like it's not that hard to come up with a good name. I think he's right that renaming it later could be a problem if you're renaming it after release or after it's in the stream of consciousness, of global consciousness. I don't think you want to rename it then, but I don't think it's like a piece de resistance, c'est ma piece de resistance. You just gotta come up with a name. It's not that hard. You want to think carefully, but not sleep on it for a month. Just name it. It's not that hard. Name your project in a generic prototype, codename warily on. Don't start with naming it, buying domains, setting up accounts, buying out Steam. Oh, buying out a Steam application. Okay. Yeah, I don't think that you should really worry about doing this stuff until later. Procedural generation, visualize it. Yeah, you want to be able to see it. Yeah, definitely. Unity stuff. Make builds as fast as possible. Yeah. Start building your game with the latest beta version of Unity. I don't agree with that. By the time you'll be finished, that beta will be stable and outdated. Yeah, I don't agree with that because... and then the follow-up is always try to use the latest stable Unity when laying in your project. Now this is Unity specific. I'm, attributing this or sliding this over to Godot or whatever other engine you're using or framework. I don't agree with that concept because, for one thing, let's take the first half. If you are working with the latest, with a beta version of anything, it's not done. Bugs can definitely crop up, and especially with engines that basically have like engines that work with projects and save values into project files or project directories and things like that. It's easy to imagine that basically you open or create a project with a beta version of any engine, and that beta version might not properly work with that beta version might basically do something to the project, right when starting. So I feel like it would be good to start with a stable version. And yeah, if you start with a stable version, it's going to be stable. Like, I don't know why you would start with a beta version, because you're working with this thing that could theoretically have problems. I don't know why you would start with that. I think beta is fine in terms of, if you're knowledgeable, if you're technically inclined, then it's like, oh, there's a beta, it has this bug or whatever, and you can work around it. But I feel like you could just easily start with a stable and not really suffer too bad, as long as the stable's not too old. And then it says always try to use the latest stable Unity when late in your project, or latest stable engine. You really want to be careful about upgrading your project, because different versions of any engine or framework can behave differently, and you don't want to just jump over to a latest version of anything unnecessarily. You want to make sure you take that as a serious, commit your code to your repository before jumping over to the latest version of Godot, the latest version of Unity. Check to make sure that everything's okay, and then jump over. Like, don't just rush into the latest stable version of whatever, just because it should have bug fixes, it should have performance improvements. It may not have either of those. Yeah, let's see. A lot of example code can be found online is absolutely horrible. It can be rewritten to be way shorter and or way more performant. That, yeah, I mean, I can agree with that. I think that is also something that could be just a product of time. I mean, a lot of example code or example projects or documentation for game development related things were written 7 years ago. I mean, it's not uncommon to look on Stack Overflow for an answer to some sort of programming question, and the answer is working, it's fine, there's nothing wrong with it, but it's 7 years old. And it's like, in those 7 years, things change. So I think it's important to know what the example code is doing and basically rewrite it yourself with that in mind. I wouldn't say it's horrible, I would say it's good for an example. Let's see. Build a photo mode into your game early on. I disagree, unless your game is like, it lends itself to a photo mode. Like, maybe if you were making a sprawling 3D action game, then maybe you would need, you could build that in. But if you're making just like a 2D, Game Boy platformer, it's like, you don't really need to. Don't make it more complex. It's fine. You can just screenshot. You're only going to need a few screenshots